As we are all aware, there is another set of priorities and that demand discussion in this committee that we cannot afford to delay. Over the past 3 weeks, our constituents have spoken out in a loud and unified voice to demand that this board take steps to increase transparency between our community and law enforcement, as well as strengthen safeguards that protect the public from excessive use of force at the hands of law enforcement. I'd like to applaud the chairman and this board for taking action last week to accelerate the rollout of our county's body-worn camera program. I'm impressed with the ambitious timeline that the chairman has proposed and that this board adopted for the report back on a path forward. And I am anxiously awaiting staff's recommendations. This sense of urgency was, of course, necessitated by what was, in my view, an inexcusable and excessive use of force by a Fairfax County police officer in Gum Springs only a few short days ago. After viewing the body-worn camera footage that detailed that officer's actions, I was completely horrified. I share the pain, the anger, and the disappointment that has been expressed to me over the last week from our county's minority communities. With these events in mind, we will be moving today's Public Safety Committee forward with an agenda that exclusively focuses on issues tied to this incident. In my view, this is the most critical long-term public safety issue facing our community and demands our immediate attention. This has been made clear to me based on the hundreds of phone calls, emails, letters, and in-person appeals that I've received from Fairfax County residents. My office has created a matrix which has been sent out to each of the board offices and also to Chief Rossler and Dave Rohr, which includes recommendations and requests that were put forward in that correspondence from organizations such as the NAACP, the ACLU, People Power, NOVA EAC, as well as hundreds of county residents. Unfortunately, we will not be able to respond to all of those recommendations today, but I wanted to ensure that those watching understood that we will be discussing a path forward today, which includes how we will engage the community in a dialogue on these issues, and we'll have a process that enables us to respond to every recommendation that we receive. So with that said, we have a pretty tight agenda, and what I'd like to do is move to our very first item. So first up, we have Chief Rossler, who will present on the department's use of force, and he'll also talk about our body-worn camera program. So, Chief Rossler.
Thank you, Supervisor Lusk and fellow Board of Supervisor members. Reform and reconciliation. Together, they are the driving forces for fair and impartial policing, which must be products of the co-production of policing model, where our policies and procedures are developed and reviewed through engagement with our communities. Legitimacy in policing is accomplished when each and every member sworn to uphold the public's trust knows the police are the community and they derive their authority from the community to protect and serve by valuing the sanctity of all human life in everything they do. Legitimacy is further upheld by ensuring all actions by law enforcement officers are proportionate, legal, accountable, necessary in order to preserve the sanctity of human life, and equitable. The pillars of the 21st century policing reforms in the Fairfax County Police Department were established by the co-production of policing model, community engagement, employee engagement, and government leader engagement, as evidenced by the formation of the Chiefs Recruitment and Diversity Council in 2013, the establishment of the Communities of Trust Committee in 2014, allowing ourselves to have outside academic review by the use of force review and recommendations from the Police Executive Research Forum, which are completed in 2015. The recommendations for change by the final report from the Ad Hoc Police Review and Practices Commission includes use of force, transparency, mental health through our Diversion First program, diversity recruitment, and accountability by creation of the Civilian Review Panel and Independent Police Auditor. These reform endeavors have not ended as we continue to hold ourselves accountable as the noble women and men of the Fairfax County Police Department, past and present, strategically carry out our vision of ethical leadership through engagement with the community to accomplish our mission, prevent and fight crime, preserve the sanctity of all human life, and to keep pace with urbanization. We are blessed with a highly engaged community that helps maintain safe environments and co-produces policing. The reform measures communities desire all across this nation of their local law enforcement are the exact pillars of our policing modes established with our communities, which we all know well today in Fairfax County. Today, staff will discuss 3 lines of business in the Fairfax County Police Department which employ and embody the sanctity of human life, provide accountability, and ensure fair and impartial policing by reforming our culture. Our internal subject matter experts will discuss our use of force policies, training and accountability, and provide an update on our body-worn camera program, and also explain how we are taking action to examine our culture through an equity lens to promote forward thinking in all we do to recognize and respect our diversity internally in order to better engage with all our communities in Fairfax County. Major Paul Cleveland, the director of the Fairfax County Criminal Justice Academy, will provide us an overview of all the use of force changes we have made over the years, including the adoption of the sanctity of human life and duty to intervene policies, and all the practices associated with that, including the prohibition of neck restraints and chokeholds that we co-produced with the community, which took effect in March of 2016. And these are under continual review by a co-production community policy team with our staff. Although our use of force changes met with national resistance, we know the value of Police Scotland's model, which is the reform we used in Fairfax County and we know is needed throughout our nation. We must also note that our independent police auditor is supervising the ongoing study of our use of force policies and practices as being conducted by the University of Texas, which will share with our community information and data to understand our use of force in the future. Major Chantel Cochran will explain how our body-worn camera policy and program was co-produced by community stakeholders and how the program was developed through a pilot project subjected to the highest levels of academic study to ensure we ethically sustain the program into the future. This will include considerations for adopting Phase 2 of the body-worn camera program in the immediate future to enhance our transparency and accountability. Lastly, Fairfax County Chief Equity Officer Carla Bruce and Captain Darrell Nichols will discuss our journey started in August of 2019 to examine our culture and create change through the use of community co-production models to achieve the strategic objectives of One Fairfax, which is equity for all. Continuous reform builds legitimacy and in turn builds trust. The women and men of the Fairfax County Police Department value their community and value the sanctity of human life. We look forward to creating more reform based upon the pillars of the 21st century policing model set out by President Obama and the other reforms that our community desires of its police department. I'll turn it over to Major Cleveland.
Thank you, Chief. I'm just going to get right into it. The Chief touched on the number of people involved and the co-production model in our use of force policy development, and I'll just touch on some finer points. The use of force policy and practice review of the Fairfax County Police Department received a final report in June 2015 from the Police Executive Research Forum. So they were actively involved and gave numerous recommendations on how we can develop and transform our use of force policies. The revisions of all use of force policies adopted the pillars of the White House Task Force on 21st Century and PERF's use of force guiding principles, and we began to put those in place in March of 2016. The Ad Hoc Police Practices Review Commission was formed by the chief, and they gave a final report in October of 2015, also making numerous recommendations which are incorporated into our use of force policies. As the chief touched on, this is important to note that we use the co-production model. We actively engage our community, we actively engage the academic field, and we actively engage professionals in our agency or in our law enforcement field to come up with the best policies, and we're always searching and striving to get better. So I'm going to jump right into the use of force policy statement, which is the first thing in our General Order 540 when you look at it. Clearly, as you heard, the chief touched on the sanctity of human life. All of our policies regarding the use of force, that is our main guiding principle, the sanctity of human life, dignity, and the liberty of all individuals. As you go in further, force is to be used only to the extent it is objectively reasonable to defend oneself or another, to control an individual during an investigative or mental detention, or lawfully effect an arrest. So as you go through these are all policies that are, co-produced, reviewed by not only our partners in law enforcement, our partners in the academic, and also our partners in the community groups have reviewed these policies. And again, the main guiding principle in our use of force, as you can read in our first opening statement on use of force in general order, is the sanctity of human life as the focus. We'll go in. Force should be based upon the totality of the circumstances known by the officer at the time force is applied without regard to the officer's underlying intent, motivation, and weighs the actions of the officer against their responsibility to protect the safety as well as the individual's civil liberties. Force shall not be used unless it is reasonably necessary in the view of circumstances confronting the officer. The application of deadly force should only be used in the most extreme circumstances where all lesser means of force have failed and could not reasonably be utilized. So that is our initial statement in use of force, and that's what we start out with. Secondly, if you go to the next page on this slide, duty to intervene. We hold our officers to the highest accountability standards possible in our profession. We added the duty to intervene through our engagement in our community, engagement with our best policies and practice. And as you clearly see, this is in our use of force policy. Any officer present and observing another officer using force that is clearly beyond that which is objectively reasonable under the circumstances shall, when in a position to do so, safely intercede to end and prevent further use of such excessive force. Additionally, officers have the duty to intervene in all other situations where an officer is acting in violation of laws, orders, policies, or ethical conduct, and immediately notify an on-duty supervisor or commander. So that is, page 2 in our policies right there. If you move on to the next slide, several questions from the Academy came from various advocate groups across the county, and I hope in this next slide I can address a number of those questions. Policies that we additionally adopted were the carotid artery restraints and chokeholds are not sanctioned force options. They are not in our policies. We do not teach them. The only thing that we would ever do is teach an officer to get out of a chokehold. We do not teach the application of chokeholds. We have not for quite some time now. We require de-escalation when possible. As the chief touched on in his opening statements, we've gone to the de-escalation model. So we require, when there is time to de-escalate a situation, we do that. As we all realize, there are going to be certain circumstances and situations where we may not have time, but our first responsibility is to attempt to de-escalate the situation when possible. We practice and we use the use of force continuum training. In plain language, we go through and we teach our cadets and our recruits and our officers to go through the use of force options and so what is appropriate. When we're at the academy, we put our officers in real life scenarios as best we can to go through those options and discuss what are those options and what are better practices. We like to, as real life as possible, put those officers under stress as much as possible so they're making good decisions. As we talk about the use of force continuum, it starts with our physical presence, and goes all the way to lethal force. And we discuss those options in various training scenarios. Moving on, we require a verbal warning before use of deadly force. Basically what that means is we will do what is a police challenge. Before deploying deadly force, we require officers to do the command of police don't move. And that's practiced from the time they're in recruit training to in service. We prohibit shooting at moving vehicles unless there's a threat of death or serious injury to an officer or other persons and no other options exist. I think in the last few years, unfortunately, we have seen that play out worldwide. We do not on a regular basis practice shooting at moving vehicles unless there is absolutely no other option and either an officer is in peril or citizens in peril where we may have a terrorist action where they're driving into a crowd, and we would have to do that. We require officers to exhaust other reasonable alternatives when possible. That is, again, we talk about the use of force continuum. So we work our way all the way through that, and as a last option, lethal force. Requiring comprehensive reporting. So in every use of force incident, we document in a report. We have extensive documentation whenever we deploy a taser, a pepper spray, any other method of use of force. That use of force immediately then is copied to our internal affairs, who gets a copy of all our deployments. They are reviewed by a first-line supervisor, and if there is injury, not only does the first-line supervisor conduct an investigation, but it's also turned over to internal affairs to do a follow-up and investigate. That is then reviewed by commanders all the way through to the chief of police. So we have quite an extensive review process, and ultimately the civilian review panel is involved in that process as well. Diversion first and crisis intervention training. So we attempt to do diversion first when possible. We realize there's mental illness, and unfortunately, we deal with a lot of that on the street situation. So we attempt to divert. We use our partners in mobile crisis and to have them respond and divert when appropriate. We are all trained. I would say we have up to date 541 officers are trained in crisis intervention training to all recognize the signs when people are in crisis. We continue to strive to get the entire department trained in crisis intervention training, and that's ongoing. Unfortunately, with the COVID events, that's been pushed back a little bit, but again, the goal is to train every officer in that. Sorry, I'll update the slides here. So when we looked at the next slide, we talk about the national decision-making model, which the chief is talking about, and at the core of that statement of mission and values is sanctity of human life. And you can see how we process through these things. I won't read each and every slide, but officers take action and review what happened, identify options and contingencies, consider powers and policy, assess the threat and pick and develop a working strategy, gather information and intelligence. So all this is an ongoing process that we work through when we're having to make decisions of using force or not. You have to realize in certain situations, obviously this process is expedited. So this comes down to continuous training and working on these things. And again, real life training, real life scenarios, putting officers in harm's way as best we can in training so that when they go out from training, they can exercise the appropriate way to use force, the appropriate verbal skills, the appropriate way to de-escalate situations when we can. Next slide, use of force. It's important to define what is the use of force. And the purpose of the use of force is to establish and maintain lawful control to protect from harm and overcome resistance to lawful duties. Control is the ability to command or direct with or without voluntary compliance. And our goal is to gain voluntary compliance. And lastly, I think the most important part of this slide is we operate off the plain principle. It's proportionate, it's legal, it's accountable, it's necessary, and it's ethical. That's our guiding principle when we're using force, is that last part there. When we assess and we review these use of force cases, we want to make sure that we're using the proportionate level of force. We're wanting to make sure that we're doing it within the legal means. We hold ourselves accountable for those use of force actions, and we will review and make sure that those uses of force are necessary and are they ethical? You know, that's the standard that we use and apply to every use of force situation. In our next slide, we'll define resistance and force. So there's what we define as three kinds of resistance. There's the passive resistance, which is an individual poses no immediate threat to an officer, but is not complying with lawful orders and is taking minimal physical action to prevent an officer from taking lawful action. Active resistance, an individual's verbal and/or physical actions are intended to prevent an officer from taking lawful action, but are not intended to harm the officer. And then there's the aggressive resistance. An individual displays the intent to cause injury, serious injury, or death to others, an officer or themselves, and prevents the officer from taking lawful action. And you can see on the bottom the types of force that we would use vary. We have less lethal force option, which is any level of force not designed to cause death or serious injury. Certainly, we have deadly force, any level of force that is likely to cause death or serious injury, and excessive force, any force which is determined not to be objectively reasonable. As we talk about these different phases of resistance, again, we go back to the de-escalation model. Again, we attempt to negotiate, we talk, try as much as possible to verbally control, de-escalate the situation. In active resistance, we go through that use of force continuum. What is the appropriate level of force that we would need to stop a situation? Aggressive resistance, at that point, an officer is in full combat, so we have to make decisions as to how we need to stop that. So again, all these things, this can happen literally in seconds, and officers have to be trained highly to be able to switch, switch in their head, switch their gears. What are they going to do? What are the options that they have, and what is appropriate? And the last part of that, the plain principle, is all of that has to be processed quickly. When we talk about the last part of this, the de-escalation, the 7 core principles, when you talk about de-escalation, the first principle, be balanced. So we're balanced in our approach. When we're approaching someone who may be in crisis, how do we talk to them? What can we do? So we have to be balanced. We have to be empathetic. We have to be real about the situation that we're facing. Self-control, critical. And, being smooth, being empathetic, creating lasting positive effects, and never humiliate. All these are the 7 core principles of de-escalation that we try to apply every day out there. And again, this is constant training. We start when they are in the academy as recruits, and we do this continuously in our in-services year after year to ensure that we're getting the latest and greatest information to our officers. We're constantly reviewing our own policies and practice to get better. And obviously we're getting as much community input on these things as possible to ensure that we're taking all these advocacy groups and our neighborhood groups into consideration when we're putting these policies together. Lastly, what I'll tell you is it's been over a 7-year process that we've been putting these together, and I would like to think Fairfax County is, if you look at the news today and you look at what these departments are asking for, banning chokeholds, de-escalation, we're there, and we've been working on this for 7 years. And I think it's important to note that, we do our very best to be ahead of that curve and continually educate ourselves. Our chief talks about constantly being a student of the profession, and we actively go out and seek, the latest and greatest, what works, what doesn't work, and we apply that here. So.
Thank you, Major Cleveland. Now we'll transition to the body-worn camera update.
Hi, my name is Chantel Cochran, and I've been involved with the co-production of the body-worn camera since 2017. This is just going to be a brief overview of the direction we're headed with our body-worn camera program. Right up here, you have the phase-in schedule. Many of you will recognize that. You've seen it before. The reason that we put this back up here is because Phase 1 has been completed. It was completed on April 28th of 2020. We actually had a goal date of May 1st, but we were able to do it a little early. So all of those stations on Phase 1, Mason, Mount Vernon, Reston, motor officers, K-9, and the DWI squad are all suited up with body-worn cameras. Now we need to discuss a little bit about the accelerated phase of 2 and 3. Right now, if you go to the next slide, this is the accelerated implementation schedule. To get it all into FY21, it will be a total of $4.5 million. It has it all broken down, all the costs and everything. All it is really just taking the 2022 and the 2023 and combining those together and getting them moved into the FY21. Currently, we are working on a timeline for the acceleration of Phase 2 and Phase 3. It's going to be detailed, and we'll put it in a memorandum for that June 30th date. Next slide. A little discussion about the body-worn camera policy. Originally, when we started this, actually, the chief started this a long time ago, in actually the summer of 2014. He started the co-production, and we rolled it out. And then when I took it over in 2014, I actually took the framework from the Virginia Department of Criminal Justice Services model. I took their policy and used that as a framework. And then we tweaked it, obviously, to suit Fairfax County and the department. And then we retained some of the same co-produce its key stakeholders and community members. We brought them back together again, and they helped us, and they gave us a great deal of input on the policy. It was very engaging to have them communicating in those meetings, so they understood some of the balancing act we had between the differing perspectives. It was presented to the Public Safety Committee, that policy, in 2015, and then the pilot program was approved in 2017. In 2018, we began the pilot program in March, and it completed it in September. And then once the completion was done, we provided all the results. We presented the results to the board, along with an academic review from American University. The co-production team continues to meet. Our last meeting was March 9th, 2020, and that was prior to the go-live phase of Phase 1 implementation. And we have another meeting that has not been scheduled yet, but I do forecast it to be in September of 2020 for that same group. The co-production, some of the stakeholders, I just wanted to remind everybody of some of the people involved. We have a lot of victim advocates in there. We have mental health and medical professionals in there. We have the Commonwealth attorneys in there. We have a great deal of people in this, and NAACP's in there. And if you'll remember, in one of the meetings that we had with the board, NAACP actually helped us and presented with us when we were asking for the pilot program, because they endorse the program. Next slide. Oh, thank you. So I just want to review a couple of things that I think is important for everybody to remember about the policy. It is a 18056. The policy mandates activation and deactivation. All body-worn equipped officers shall activate their body-worn camera during their response to a scene or as soon as it is practical and safe to do so, and leave it on for the duration of the incident. We also have further language in the policy that kind of drills into that, so it gives the officer a better snapshot of all the different cases that they should be. So I'm going to really quickly go through that list. Call for service. Upon arrival at any call for service, traffic or subject stop, self-initiated event involving a rendering of public service or law enforcement related activity, searches of persons, buildings, vehicles, searches for suspects who have fled a scene, collection of physical evidence of a crime, or transportation of any person in custody. So you can see we're very detailed so the officers understand anytime they're using any law enforcement their powers, it should be activated. I will go over here shortly on some of the restrictions to those due to privacy reasons. We do have our ITB, our Technology Bureau is currently working on some emerging technology we're very excited about. They actually have, they're testing and evaluating for holster. Well, when you remove your gun from the holster, your body-worn camera activates automatically. We're testing those right now. And they're also looking into the same type of equipment for the ECW. So hopefully we'll be able to get those in. As I was talking about the privacy and the restricted use, obviously we are trying to balance the privacy rights and the constitutional safeguards while promoting department transparency and accountability. So when we met with the co-producers of this policy, they were loud and clear, and they asked for certain things. So I'll go through a list of things that I think it's important for everybody to know. If an officer is in a medical or mental facility, they will deactivate their body-worn camera. Oops, sorry. Unless the patient is adversarial or they can predict that they're going to have to use force. That's mainly because there's so many issues on HIPAA, people's private information. You know, it's a private situation. In courthouses, we have officers power down. When an officer is responding to a police service, the owner, let's say they have a reasonable expectation of privacy and the officer arrives at their front door, they can ask the officer to turn off their body-worn camera and the officer will comply. Now, if it changes over to some sort of a criminal event, then the officer will activate their body-worn camera. Detailed victim statements, they deactivate, and community members reporting a crime, they also deactivate. Most other circumstances, and school grounds, I missed that one. School grounds, we put in there that they will only activate the body-worn camera for law enforcement purposes only. And the reason we put that in there is because if an officer is responding to a school or if we have an SRO with a body-worn camera on, we didn't want people to believe that the officer was walking around the halls with that activated all the time. That's not true. It's deactivated, and if they have to use law enforcement reasons, then they would activate it. Next slide. And then I wanted to talk a little bit about the transparency and release of footage. It's very similar to the release of anything. It's all under a General Order 402, release of information, records, and documents. And in this policy, it says, at the direction of the Chief of Police or designee, the Public Affairs Bureau FOIA Compliance Section shall coordinate all release and redaction of body-worn camera recordings. So it's very similar to the way we release any of our in-car video and reports, and everything is pretty much falls under that 402 general order. And then I just wanted to mention really quickly that we do have sharing capabilities with the Office of Commonwealth's Attorney, and they have the capability in evidence.com to share it with defense attorneys.
Thank you, Major.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Okay, thank you very much for those presentations. They were extremely informative. If I could start with maybe just a couple questions I'll ask, and then I'll hand it off to my colleagues on the board. And maybe this one might be for Chief Rossler. I clearly appreciate and recognize that we have very comprehensive use of force policies here in Fairfax County. As you went through the detailed analysis talking about de-escalation, force options, resistance, and levels of control, when those policies are adhered to, we don't have an incident like we had in Gum Springs. So in light of what's happened, I guess, how will we adjust or alter our training to ensure that our use of force policies are adhered to, and then also ensuring that our diversion first and incident control training is adhered to as well?
Well, we are very grateful for the Board of Supervisors approving in prior budgets from the ad hoc recommendations and the PFM study that we increase our level of supervision. So one layer of protection is to have 2 supervisors, first line, a sergeant and a second lieutenant, working with the patrol squads at all times, and that was the relief sergeant program. So that allows us to ensure a supervisor can respond to the scene as quickly as possible to slow the event down and negotiate our way out of it. Clearly, that is not available if something rapidly unfolds, but again, we try to slow it down. But we're looking at events not only here in Fairfax County, but around this world that go viral And my immediate challenge is I go to Colonel Lee, who's in charge of the academy that Major Cleveland runs, and say, does our policy cover this? And then we'll go back to our community stakeholder groups into co-production and we'll tabletop our policy. So, for example, right now, we are in the mode of looking at our bias-based policing, our hate crime policies, and as you will hear shortly through our chief equity officer, we're looking at the internal culture. The mental well-being of officers is also critical, that you're not at work agitated, because what we are seeing right now that is awful in the law enforcement profession, especially with the protest, people exercising their free speech, is other jurisdictions are using force when it's probably not appropriate. So we got to go back to training, and it's leadership. It's holding our leaders accountable and the officers accountable, and the transparency of discipline. Obviously, the two vehicles are the civilian review panel and the independent police auditor, but we could do better. We could do more, and reform is the right way to go, and we need to continue that.
Okay, I appreciate that response, and I'll say it's kind of imperative that we have examples of kind of model behavior and that we can show and demonstrate that in this situation, this is how an officer did the right thing. And then you have examples very clearly where an officer has not done the right thing, and you want to be able to delineate that as well.
And I'm so proud of the women and men of the Fairfax County Police Department as we allow everybody to exercise their free speech. We are blessed. People are thankful. They are calling myself and others to organize to help them. And that's the way we do it in Fairfax, and we shall continue that.
No, thank you again. Let me ask, just on a question with regard to the body-worn cameras. I like the approach that you're taking with the use of technology, so emerging technology is certainly going to be helpful. And I'll say, being able to activate the camera automatically is going to be best if possible. So obviously the holster component that you talked about earlier makes a lot of sense to me. What other maybe self-activation technologies could we consider as well? So I'm thinking out loud, but clearly there are instances where if the police officer raises his voice at a pretty high decibel, or if he shouts a certain command, or even, maybe makes a harsh statement, would we be able to have that be a cue for the camera to automatically come on?
So I have not explored that, and I'm not even sure if the voice activation exists or if we're looking into that. I can find that answer out for you, no problem. But I do know that we are also looking at the activation of your body-worn camera when you respond to something and you turn your emergency equipment on. Because a lot of our officers will turn their emergency equipment on when they're coming into a situation that they want to make sure that their other officers can find them. So obviously the lights are a great way. So as soon as you turn that on, it would activate your body-worn camera. So anything that's out there, I do believe our ITB is very forward-thinking. So I do believe that they would look into that. And just hearing you now, I guarantee you that they will be looking into it.
I was going to say I would request if they could and bring that back. I'd be very curious to take a look at what options might be available. And then I'll ask one more question, and then I'll hand it off to my colleagues. Looking at the body-worn camera footage, there's going to be so much data that comes in, and it's going to be almost impossible to view all of that footage. So again, thinking about emerging technology, there might be some way for us to use some data mining software or programs that can actually go in and basically pull out if there is, I don't know, some extended points of contact between the officer and one of our residents. Or again, if the person's raising their voice and shouting commands. And I'm wondering if we could also look at that type of technology to help us in basically auditing and seeing what data has been collected on those videos.
Yes, Supervisor Lusk, we are looking at that, and the bio capability of the turn on the camera. I must remind everyone our in-car video system also has an automatic turn on when we activate the emergency equipment. And we do have the capability of systems to go 4-speed to audit the videos, and that is part of our policy, is to audit the in-car videos and the body-worn camera, and obviously the other challenge is for court purposes and discovery, whether or not you could use that technology or you have to watch it real time.
Got it. Okay. No, appreciate that response. And I'll now open it up to my colleagues who'd like to.
Mr. Chairman.
I'll have Mr. Chairman Jeff McKay first, and it looks like Walter Alcorn second. And if there's anybody else, I'll take you after that.
Thank you very much, Chairman, and thank you for the presentation from our Majors in Chief. Very well done. I have a couple of questions, but before my questions, just a simple request. I think everyone's heard of the Campaign Zero's 8 Can't Wait program, and I have a sheet, a one-pager in my hand from the Arlington County Police that walks through those elements, and actually what you just presented is almost a mirror image of that. And so if there's a way for us to develop a one-sheeter, I think there's a important story here to be told to the public, because people, of course, are watching a lot of things happening nationally and drawing conclusions about things that we need to do that we've already done. That's not to say we don't have a lot more still to do, but I think as a marker in time, making sure the community can clearly see where we are would be really helpful in communication. And so that's just a request that we put together that one-pager similar to what Arlington's done. My questions, and I want to drill down just on 3 things. One, the training, because obviously the training is as important as the policy, and I think we all recognize that. In the presentation, it says that twice a year we do training on use of force and de-escalation, and I'm wondering how that compares to our peer public safety groups, and if that's a best practice, that twice a year is a sufficient amount of training to happen. And then secondly, under training, the % of our officers right now that are CIT certified, because I know we're not finished with all of that training. If you could give me an update on that for training. And then I have 2 other questions after that, but let me ask the training questions first.
Yes, sir, Mr. McKay. First, your request, our responses were from that Arlington, so we're looking at probably drafting something like that, and we'll get that done for you. We took that into account with our responses, knowing that was going to probably come up. Secondly, training. When you talk about what we do twice a year, we are actually ahead of most jurisdictions our size and in our region. So we do that twice a year in service, and obviously we open the training facilities, so if squads want to do extra training, things like that, we have no problem with them coming out on their own and doing extra. We require 2 in-services a year, but that's not to say that that's all the training they can do. We have plenty of squads, we have plenty of specialty units that come out numerous times throughout the year to go over tactics and training and things like that. So 2 is the mandatory requirement, but we typically exceed that.
And I'll address the crisis intervention team training. We're about 40% right now. We're aggressively trying to get 100%. We've lost a few months, and this morning I was talking to Darrell Washington from the CSB and Lisa Potter to get back online, hopefully in phase 3, to keep that aggressive schedule. And I'm real thankful for the CSB supporting us. And when it comes to training twice a year, we exceed the state mandates for training. We have our own performance-based objectives, and the state training is a lot less, and it needs to be exactly what we're doing statewide.
Okay, thank you. And then a question on equipment, because we talked about body-worn cameras, but I know, and just a little trip down memory lane, but I know our board adopted a policy that I believe prohibited purchase of any type of military equipment or weaponry. And I just wanted to make sure that you could confirm for us what the policy is on that type of equipment in Fairfax County.
Yes, sir. We have no military-grade equipment from the military. We don't participate in the programs. The equipment that we have is custom-made for Fairfax County, particular in our Special Operations Division. We work through the county's purchasing and supply management, the competitive bid for that equipment to make sure it fits in our vision statement of keeping pace with urbanization. and it's not to be used to give an image of occupying this county or any of the communities in the county. It's to help rescue community members in need and/or officers. It's not to be used to create any military visual, as other departments unfortunately do throughout the United States.
And I think it'd be helpful, Chief, if we could circulate the policy, because I know the board reviewed this. It was some years ago, but it begs to be looked at again and routinely, just to make sure that we understand what it is. And then my last question is with the body-worn camera program, and I want to make sure I'm reading the chart right, because as I look at the baseline funding required, and then I look at the tiers of implementation, the area that I'm troubled with, frankly, is the patrol officer component of it. So on page 10, when I look at phase 3, there's a lot of specialty units on there: animal control, parking enforcement, special ops division. But I notice obviously Fair Oaks is on there, Franconia is on there, and Lorton may or may not be online that quickly. So I guess my question is if we were to move Fair Oaks and Franconia into phase 2, given the total baseline funding required for FY 2023 is $1.147 million, if we move those two elements of FY 2023 into FY 2022 so that all of our patrol offices, kind of the frontline folks, would have body-worn camera equipment deployed, is it a financial, I can't imagine, I will say, as budget chair, I don't think that's a financial constraint, but operationally, would it be a challenge for us to do that? And if so, what is that challenge to try to accelerate at least those two existing stations to come online in FY 2022 with the rest of the patrol officers in the county?
Very good question, Chairman. We are locked into a 5-year contract, so we have absolute flexibility. And from an operational perspective, if we wanted to rearrange the priorities, we could do that. It is not an issue.
Okay, I think that's good to hear, because I think we'll want to have a conversation about that. Obviously, getting them to as many officers as possible is good, but those patrol officers in particular from those stations are usually the first folks having conversations or intervening with the community. And so from an equity standpoint, I think we need to look at it through that lens as we move forward. But excellent presentation. Appreciate that we've come a long way. This has been a good walk through history for a lot of us, but also certainly appreciate the expression that there's still improvement we can make as a department and community. I think to be the best, you got to constantly evolve, really pivot, and continue to display best practice. So thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to now recognize Supervisor Alcorn.
Thank you very much, Supervisor Lusk. Well, first of all, thank you, Supervisor Lusk, for your leadership on this. I know this is not what you expected to be doing with the Public Safety Committee, but this is really important for the county, and I know the board appreciates it. I do look forward to the public engagement process. I think we're going to be talking about that more in a few minutes. Because we have, I know many of us, and I believe your matrix that you sent around, Supervisor Lusk, reflects this. Many of us have received a number of ideas that I think are worth further discussion and evaluation. I did want to focus just a bit on some of the issues you raised regarding technology and some of the questions you raised. I think I have this feeling that during the coming months, there's going to be quite a bit of attention paid to technology used in our public safety systems. I also have a feeling there might be actually some federal money that pops up that would be looking for places to maybe demonstrate some of these newer technologies that come out that are frankly designed not just to address some of the things that our body-worn camera program and others address, but perhaps to look at some of the other issues that we haven't discussed yet. For example, threat detection systems, things that actually help our officers do their jobs more safely. And I just want to make sure that we are in a position, and I think we are, based on what I'm hearing, that we're in a position to take advantage of that and frankly look for opportunities for Fairfax County to play the leadership role in showing how we can use these technologies to have a more engaged police force, a smarter police force, that we look for opportunities to use our resources that way, because I think, as has been said, we've made a tremendous amount of progress in recent years, and I want to keep that going. And one last thing, one last piece of information that I'd be looking for, and I have to say, this is all new to me. I haven't been on the board very long, and I missed a lot of the fun over the last few years, but I would be interested in getting just some basic information, and perhaps if someone in the police department could point me at some point after this committee to the right place where I could see. I'm interested in what is the percentage of calls, what types of, basically, where are police officers being called to? Whenever a call comes in, how many are for traffic stops? How many are for, domestic abuse situations? I'd be very interested in getting a better sense of just how our police department is being used in the community and what services are being called for by the public. So anyway, I think that'll, for me at least, that would help frame some of the discussion that I think we'll have over the coming months on these topics. So thank you very much, Mr. Lusk, for all this.
Thank you, Mr. Alcorn.
Mr. Chairman.
Yes, Madam Vice Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you to our police department and its leadership for the presentation and for all the things that we've done over the last many years. 7 years ago, it was an extraordinarily painful time. I don't think any of us wants to repeat that. But we did the right thing, even though it was very, very difficult. We did the right thing, and we have what has been shown before us today as a result of that. So that's good. I have a couple of questions, and Chantel, hi Chantel. Chantel used to be, we worked together at the Mason Station. I think you mentioned something about officers going into schools, but I see that SROs are on the to be determined list, after phase 3. Were you talking about an officer who is not an SRO who might be going into a school?
Correct. We've not
Okay.
decided on the SROs yet. That's something that the boards will decide.
Okay, thank you. There was a question about use of force and de-escalation training, and it's mandated twice a year, but I wanted to be clear, that's not show up on Saturday and then 6 months from now show up on another Saturday. This is training that is going on all the time, so you might have officers in a station getting training, and then 3 months later the other officers are doing. So this is a constant rotation, so you've got the constant flow of information going to all of the officers in the station. Is that a good way to characterize it?
Yes, ma'am, that's accurate, absolutely. So we have the twice a year that's mandated by our department to go out and demonstrate those skills. And that's where, as the chief touched on, we're ahead of the state level. But we are constantly evolving. We are constantly doing continuous training. Not only are we doing it scenario-based, whether it be at the academy or whether it be at the stations, but there's constant, video debriefing our own incidents and things like that. So the training is ongoing.
Okay, I thought that was what I understood. Question about the car video and the car audio. I know watching the body-worn camera footage, of various things has been so much better than the car video and the car audio, but is there at some point going to be an opportunity to sort of coordinate that all so you don't have body worn camera here and car video here and they don't quite mesh? Is that something that would be future technology, or is that something that we would still be doing sort of both, you know, running parallel to each other?
I've mandated we migrate to a simple system because during the pilot project, it was rather cumbersome that you had two separate systems that did not talk to each other. So we are working with the procurement director, Ms. Muse, to go through a process because that's available. One microphone, one pipeline, two systems, because it gives you more of, you're not going to get the 360 view, but it's cumbersome for the officers. And as you alluded to, sometimes the in-car video, especially the microphone, gets out of sync with the video when you get a certain distance away. So that's a challenge that we're immediately fixing, especially in phase one here.
Okay, and then just a last comment, because I know Supervisor Alcorn asked about what kinds of calls the police respond to, especially for our newer members of the board who share space with police stations. Have regular contact with your commander, your station commander and assistant commander. I've been doing that for 24 years. It has been enormously helpful. Ed Raza will attest to that, because when we first met, you were the assistant commander here at this Ed Mason station. You keep in touch. You set up those communication opportunities, and it's really very, very beneficial because we're able to give the community perspective to the commanders, and they're able to give us the information that we need. I highly recommend it. Highly recommend it. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Any other members would like to?
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman, this is Stork.
Okay.
Mr. Chairman, Supervisor Harity.
Supervisor
Supervisor
Palchak first, Supervisor Stork, Supervisor Harity third.
Oh, okay. Thank you. I
Palchak first.
appreciate it. All right. Thank you, Mr.